Hello and welcome to a new episode of Majlis and Markets with your host Hassan Jivraj. In this podcast, we bring you thought-provoking conversations with influential leaders in Islamic and global markets. As usual, before we begin today, wherever you're listening to us, please remember to like, share and subscribe. It really does help us out. You can also send your feedback, comments, questions and suggestions to our email, hassan@majlisandmarkets.com. Today, we're diving into the world of Islamic fintech. Over the past decade, digitalisation and technology have transformed financial services, including payments and interactions between customers and businesses. Islamic fintech aims to do the same, but in a Sharia-compliant way. So what sets Islamic fintech apart from conventional fintech? What unique challenges does it face? And what does its future look like? To find out, we spoke with Abdul Hasib Basit, a digital finance expert with over 25 years of experience. His work at the intersection of finance, technology and strategy offers valuable insights. In our discussion, we explored the landscape of Islamic fintech, its unique features, challenges, and future prospects. Abdul Hasib Basit, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Good to have you here.
Assalamu alaikum, Hassan. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Wa alaikum salam. It's been long overdue, Abdul Hasib. It's been a long time since we last caught up in person, but unfortunately we're on Zoom or on over the airwaves today. But Abdul Hasib, you've got like a really interesting background. I met you probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I was covering Islamic economy and writing about Islamic fintech. And your background in like Islamic fintech, obviously you're very well known in that, and then also your background in banking, in conventional banking or like the conventional banking world is really fascinating as well. But before we get into all of that, could you give us like your early life and like your story basically?
Of course. I was born in the UK. I'm originally Pakistani, but very early on, my parents moved to the Middle East. And so the first 10 years of my life were predominantly spent in Saudi Arabia with a stint back in Pakistan in Lahore, sandwiched in the middle. And I came back to the UK when I was 10 years old and did most of my later academia in the UK. I graduated in management studies from Brunel, and I spent the early part of my career in accountancy. I qualified as a management accountant working at BNU, which is a Dutch publisher in their London office. I was there for almost 5 years. And having qualified as an accountant, the thing that used to happen was that the recruiters would hit you up and try and get you into financial services. The banks were booming at that time. This is sort of around 2004. And I found my way into financial services, not really through any particular design, but it just seemed to be where qualified accountants were most sought after and highly remunerated, and it made sense. And I spent almost 10 years in conventional banking. And during that period, I really started to reflect on my career and my chosen profession and how it aligned with my faith. And the more I pondered this, the more uncomfortable I became in what I was doing. I worked in sort of middle and back office, mainly within the banks, which were things around strategy, technology, and working in the finance function, being an accountant. And latterly, I moved into the private bank at Credit Suisse, where I spent most of my career. And at that point, I did an MBA at Imperial, really to try and explore what else was out there in terms of career opportunities. And I came to the realization that really my specialisms were finance, technology, strategy, and that was predominantly where my career would remain. It just so happened that at the time, fintech was growing in the UK. I was exploring fintech as a possible sector to move into. I was actually looking actively at fintech solutions for the bank and finding I wasn't getting much traction. And this sort of not only with the sort of faith alignment, this hugely frustrated me because I could see where technology was going in the financial services space. And I thought the bank was a little bit behind in its thinking. And I read an article where George Osborne, the Chancellor at the time in the UK, was quoted as saying that the government wanted to support the fintech industry. They were looking forward to a industry association being set up, and I thought that was quite interesting. I found the folks who were setting up the industry association, and it turned out I was the first hire at the industry association. I became CFO and helped set up that group. It's called Innovate Finance. It's still running today as the UK's representative membership association for fintech. And I was there for 3.5 years, after which the CEO and I left and started our own practice, which is called Ellipsis. Ellipsis is predominantly a venture builder, research, investment firm. We do a number of things. I think the thing, as you mentioned, that we're probably most known for in the Islamic finance space is the Global Islamic Fintech Report, which we produce in collaboration with Dinar Standard. And we just released the latest version of that report in February this year.
Fantastic. Abdul Hasib, before we get into fintech and Islamic finance and everything, you mentioned that you lived in Saudi Arabia. Like, what was that like growing up in Saudi Arabia?
I think as a kid it was fantastic. My dad is a retired surgeon. He was there working in the medical school and hospitals as the Saudis were building up that specialism and wanted Western educated doctors to come in and help run that. It was great. We lived an expat lifestyle. We were slightly secluded from Saudi society, although being Muslim, I think we had probably more access to it than non-Muslim expats that were there at the time. And it was really a great lifestyle. I think I was aware at the time, being in a family with I had two sisters and my mum was there as well. I was quite aware of the social restrictions placed on them. And I think even as a youngster, it was very, very apparent. Given that I'd had a stint in Pakistan in the middle, which was a very different experience, and then going back to Saudi and experiencing that. I think that it was an interesting time. I think it was a very unique time. I think the Middle East is a very different place now to what it was back then, in the sort of late 80s. But I hugely enjoyed it as a childhood. And I think moving to the UK was a bit of a culture shock at the age of 10. And I think that it's a very different experience being a Muslim in the UK versus being a Muslim in a Muslim majority country. Things don't come as easy in the UK, and I think throughout my later life, I've found ways to realign with my faith more. I think that's probably been a symptom of living in a Western society.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. You talked about your studies and then joining as an accountant. When did you first hear about Islamic finance?
So I probably first heard about Islamic finance in the late 90s, just at the start of my career. I wasn't in finance at the time. I'd sort of seen and read a few things, but it wasn't really in mainstream discourse, I would say, at the time. And as I got into financial services and started looking into it more and more, I came across a documentary by a chap called Tariq Al-Dawani, which many people in Islamic finance will know. And that was really my first foray into Islamic finance or understanding Islamic finance. And then thereafter, I read his book. I read a number of other books, including Kharis Irfan's book, who I know you've had on the podcast as well. And that really shaped my thinking around finance and the role of finance in society. Fast forward, sort of when I got to my MBA stage, my thesis at the end of my MBA was squarely focused on Islamic private equity. It was an area I was quite interested in. I thought it had, lots of natural alignment to the way Islamic finance should be done. And through connections that I had at the time, and through just the fact that I was doing an MBA and working at a tier one bank like Credit Suisse, I just outbounded a load of people in the Islamic finance space. Many of them were very gracious with their time as part of my research and onward connecting me to other people. I would rock up to conferences that were happening in London that were Islamic finance conferences and just start networking with people. And the one thing I found is, everyone was really giving of their time and advice, and those connections have stayed with me to this day. And I've had the very good fortune of working with some of those people, in more recently in my career.
Yeah, I think you were probably in the like when the momentum was really gaining in the traditional sense. Like, you had Islamic Bank of Britain, I think in the early 2000s, and you had like Gatehouse and all these other banks coming in, and then a lot of legislative changes were happening at the time, in the run up to the debut Sukuk that was done in 2014. So I think you were probably like when it was at the peak, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was around then. I was aware of all of that activity happening, but I wasn't in the Islamic finance space. And it's quite interesting having explored Islamic finance. Um, I would say post financial crisis 2007 and 8 really seriously as a jumping off point from conventional banking. I wasn't really able to find a home within Islamic finance, and I did know people that worked at some of those Islamic banks. I knew people who'd set up those Islamic banks, and they were very good contacts of mine. But there was something about Islamic banking that didn't really sit quite right with me, so I wasn't really able to find a home. Where I was able to find a home was in fintech, and quite unexpectedly, what happened is after a couple of years in fintech, I started receiving messages from people in the Islamic finance space trying to understand, um, what fintech was going to do to the Islamic finance sector, and that's really where that foray into Islamic fintech began. So I would say that was probably around 2016, 17, really when Islamic fintech started to become a thing.
Yeah, I agree. Before we get into that, Abdul Hasib, I really want to unpack like what is fintech. It's I think it's a very loosely used term nowadays, but maybe from your perspective, maybe you could tell our listeners what do you mean by fintech or what is fintech?
So very simply, fintech is just the application of any new or emerging technology to financial services provision. Who it's done by, I think, is largely irrelevant. It can be done by a startup. It can be done by a bank. Many people in the fintech space would probably argue that the first type of fintech was the ATM, which was technology applied to providing a financial service. Nowadays, fintech, you can really dissect it to the nth degree. I think, there's lots of different types of fintech. So in the early days of fintech, sort of, I would say probably, sort of looking at 2014 onwards in the UK, a lot of fintech innovation was really simply just business model innovation with technology, with an internet technology applied to it. It's become more sophisticated now. I think now the application of emerging technologies that didn't exist at the time, so things like blockchain, digital assets, AI, into financial services has a real role to play in the way financial services will be delivered to the consumer, but also the way the financial services itself as an industry will evolve. So I think that's how I would loosely describe it. I think you can get very prescriptive with what is and what isn't fintech, but I think broadly for me, it's any application of technology within financial services whose aim is to improve the customer experience or the actual provision of that service in financial services.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It seems like I first heard about fintech probably in the early 2010s, when your bank basically said you can check your banking online and you can do all of this online rather than visiting a branch or visiting your bank manager if you were a corporate client. Um, so I guess like it was this digitalization of like banking services, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think most people's experience of that was, moving from a branch-based service with your bank to a an online portal of some sort. And nowadays, I think even walking into a branch or even calling your bank seems really alien to most people now. Most people will be able to do most of their financial services transactions on their smartphone. And that's really what fintech has done over the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely. Like today, I think we take it for granted, but if you look at it within context in the last, say, 15, 20 years, it's come quite a long way. Like back in the day, if you wanted to get something done, you'd have to wait in the queue at the bank branch and then see the person and then like fill out a bunch of forms. Now you can do it at the touch of the button with a phone, which it doesn't seem that extraordinary today, but like if you consider that like 2000 or 2005, like it's quite a step. But like, why do you think a lot of like financial providers or even people in the industry don't like fintech too much?
I think my assessment wouldn't be that they don't like fintech too much. I would say that the narrative around fintech in the early days was that fintech's going to kill the banks, and I think that put a lot of people's backs up. And of course, whenever you threaten anyone's livelihood, they're going to have an adverse reaction to that. I don't think that's necessarily been the case. I don't think that's transpired. What we've seen is what startups who've been successful have done is really pushed banks to improve their service, improve their game. And a lot of fintech innovation that you see happening outside of the banks gets absorbed pretty quickly by banks. So I wouldn't say that people don't like fintech. I think consumers certainly like fintech, and I think the services that are made available to consumers. I mean, people use the term, fintech is democratizing finance. I'm not a big fan of that term, but I think what it's doing is providing easier access, and access to people who perhaps didn't have access to these services before, in a much more approachable and easier fashion. So I think from a consumer point of view, I think fintech is hugely popular. I think fintech is hard to do. I think it's a regulated industry, financial services, and for that reason, it's not like other tech, where social media, for example, there were no rules around social media at the beginning when social media was taking off. So what social media firms did was not really scrutinized, not really regulated. If you're a fintech firm, apart from a few specific activities, you're probably going to fall into or touch some sort of regulated activity. If you're handling people's money, you're definitely going to be within the regulatory perimeter, and that makes launching and running a fintech significantly harder than any other sort of tech firm.
Yeah, what's also interesting as well is that, for example, if there's an outage at a bank or something, or there's like a glitch, the founder or the CEO or someone really senior within the company will come on Twitter straight away and be like, say, look, we're sorry for the outage or sorry for the stuff going on. Whereas you couldn't imagine someone from like HSBC or NatWest, like the CEO, coming out and saying, look, we've made a mistake here or something. Just please bear with us. So I guess it's kind of more personal, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that, at the end of the day, even though it's a technology firm, there are humans behind it, right? So, um, what consumers don't like is I'm using a service where I cannot speak to a person if I have a problem. Consumers hate that, and it's all well and good you adding chatbots and email addresses for your support team on your app, but if they take 2-3 days to respond, that's really classed as a poor service. So the flip side of that being that you have an outage on a neobank app, and the CEO gets on Twitter and is basically live tweeting through that process of what the issue is, how long it's going to take to resolve, and what happened, and what they're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's a level of engagement that you see from fintechs towards their customers that you don't necessarily see from banks, because banks will hide behind layers of call centers and processes that frustrate consumers, and that's why you know you see a lot of uptake of fintech, because quite frankly, after 2007 and 8, people were quite fed up with their banks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting. Like my mom, who's probably in her 60s now, and like she likes using fintech services rather than going into the bank. But Abdul Hasib, there's obviously we've had fintech, and it's quite a well-developed thing both here and globally. But then on the other layer is Islamic fintech. What is Islamic fintech?
So quite simply, Islamic fintech is really just the application of that same technology first mindset into Islamic finance. An Islamic fintech for me is somebody who is using the tenets of Islamic finance, building a fintech firm. It's the application of a fintech service that is not in the contravention of Sharia compliance to to Islamic finance. It is the application of fintech technologies that are, by their very nature, Sharia compliant. So things like payment gateways into Muslim majority markets where they are looking to improve financial services. So again, very very broad definition, but predominantly it's a subset of fintech where the principles of Islamic finance are being applied.
And is the Islamic fintech ecosystem developed, like globally? Is it quite developed or is it quite nascent?
Yeah, so I was looking at the I was looking at the questions you sent through, and you had a question about these questions about Islamic fintech, and I started to reflect and look back at actually where did this term emerge from, and I did go online and have a quick search about what was the first sort of mention of Islamic fintech, and actually I can't take credit for coining the term, but in 2017, at a conference in London, we produced, in collaboration with the conference organizers IFN, we produced the first ever Islamic fintech landscape. And I think that was the first time the term was really put into the mainstream. And what that did was it was really just a Luma landscape of all the Islamic fintech firms that were in the public domain globally, segmented into their various subsectors. And at that point, in September 2017, we identified 110 Islamic fintech firms globally. One of the interesting things we found is that the UK actually was the largest producer of Islamic fintech firms at the time. And that landscape is something that we've been tracking since 2017. So fast forward 7 years, we've now got 417 Islamic fintech firms globally in our latest report. So it's quadrupled in 7 years in terms of the size of the sector, just by looking at the volume of firms.
Yeah, and do you think like the traditional Islamic finance centers like Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, UAE, Saudi lead the way in Islamic fintech?
Yeah, so it's really important to understand why fintech emerges in a particular jurisdiction. And I had the privilege of being at the forefront of that with Innovate Finance in the UK. And really, it's regulation, capital, and talent are the three main pillars that any good ecosystem needs to develop. So the trigger in the UK was really the FCA's competition mandate, post financial crisis. What they were really looking to do was authorize new players within the regulated space. And that gave the opportunity for tech first firms or fintechs to emerge in this regulated, within this regulated perimeter and launch services. Now, that example has been seen across the world and has been used by regulators in a more, I would say, sort of limited fashion, but allowing certain firms to develop in certain areas. So what we see in some of these OIC countries is that we see specific regulations enacted for challenger banks, for example. So you may have a jurisdiction that says we are going to authorize 5 new challenger banks. So it's not a carte blanche. Anyone can do this. We're going to give out limited licenses, and then firms who are interested in doing so put their case forward and apply, and a few of those are successful and they launch. What that's done is over time that's helped these jurisdictions catch up in from a fintech perspective generally. And of course, being Muslim countries, there is a consumer base that is looking for Islamic finance services. So we've naturally seen Islamic finance follow that trajectory. So now what we see is the UK was the largest producer of Islamic fintechs in 2017. Now it's Indonesia at the top, Malaysia, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, with the UK make up the other top 5 countries. And what we're seeing is, other countries, interestingly, places like Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Kuwait are really starting to catch up as well.
Yeah, I agree. Like it's the UK back in 2017 was like quite a hub for Islamic finance or Islamic fintech activity rather up until say like 21, 22. But like talking on a global spectrum, what I see, Abdul Hasib, is like there are a lot of Islamic fintechs, but like the incumbents of Islamic finance, like the likes of these banks, like Emirates Islamic Bank in the UAE or Al Baraka Bank in Bahrain or KFH in Kuwait or even the ones in Malaysia, they're kind of like recognizing this technology and coming up with their own products, right?
Yeah, so I think country to country, the financial services landscape is very different, right? So I think UK Islamic banks, and the reason they were set up is very different to a UAE Islamic bank, for example, and what they do. I think UAE is, or generally GCC Islamic banks and Malaysian and Indonesian Islamic banks are very much more focused on the retail market and the SME market. That is that is predominantly who they serve. The UK Islamic banks were not set up for that purpose, and so we have this situation where we have a number of regulated UK Islamic banks, and we have a very low penetration within the Muslim community of those banks. Now, part of that is the reason is they just don't provide the services that UK Muslims need, and that really gave the space for Islamic fintechs in the UK to come in and start offering those services. In other jurisdictions, it's different. In other jurisdictions, it is a more competitive space because you have not only the Islamic fintechs in that market, but also the banks who serve that retail audience competing for that same attention and same dollar. So what you'll find is those banks are often better at adopting technology than some of the UK banks. And also, one of the things you have to understand is that those banks are probably earlier in their life cycle. So from the perspective of their technology stack, they're probably not encumbered by old technology like UK banks are. So, for example, when we had the likes of Monzo coming out in the UK, where you would make a transaction and it would send you a ping to your mobile phone saying that this transaction has left your account. None of the UK banks at the time were doing that. At the same time, banks in the Middle East were already doing that. So they were already ahead of the curve in some of these kind of functionalities that started with fintech in the UK. That they already existed in banks in the Middle East. So it's a very different landscape. I think each jurisdiction is different, each regulatory environment different. The risk appetite of banks and regulators is different jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So the evolution is very unique in each jurisdiction as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you have like any off the top of your mind, like any success stories of like really successful Islamic fintechs that have done well over the past, say, like 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, I think that there's a few examples. I think Wahid is probably the standout in the industry, having launched in the US and launched here in the UK and Malaysia, UAE, and other jurisdictions. They've also diversified their product offering from starting from robo-advisory. They now have a number of other services. So they have Wahid Ventures, which is investing in startups. They've just launched a real estate investment service on their platform as well. I think we have in the UK, we have Islamic Finance Guru, which predominantly launched as a sort of a comparison service at the beginning, but now have their own investments through Curate Capital, their the sort of investment arm. We have Ethis in the Far East, which again started off as crowdfunding peer-to-peer and has grown into other verticals, other geographies. Most recently, the folks behind Ethis have launched again a VC fund. And I think that probably for me, the one that's seen the most rapid growth is a platform called Abhi from Pakistan, which is a sort of a salary fulfillment service where employees can draw down their salary early, and is now developing a whole host of other solutions around that, around HR and payroll, and has been aggressively expanding into the Middle East very, very quickly after their launch. So we've seen some things that are well funded, well backed, able to grow very quickly across borders as well. And then we have others that are doing very well within their niche sort of vertical and geography as well. And I think every year that we examine this space, what we're seeing is more and more growth in every geography and every vertical. And I think that's been an interesting trajectory that we're still tracking.
Yeah. Just to push back a little bit on some things, like we had Hussein Kanji on a few episodes ago, and he was quite he was quite skeptical on the whole Islamic fintech, specifically Islamic fintech or Islamic fintech offering, both with regards to product and ecosystem. He said, like, if you basically if you think that the product is really good, why don't you make it for everybody, not just specifically for Muslims? Like, do you think there's a little bit too much like hype or like marketing around Islamic fintech that is specifically Islamic and not really like being competitive in terms of service and price?
Um, I would agree and disagree with some of that. So I think if it's a good product, why should it not appeal to everybody? I agree with that, and I think that the best Islamic fintechs do appeal to a non-Muslim audience as well. So I've worked with some Islamic fintechs through the years, and typically a number of their customers will be non-Muslim, so they won't be there because they believe in the sort of underlying ethos of Islamic finance. They're there because it's a superior product, and either provides a superior service, or if it's an investment product, a superior return. And I think typically those for those that I've examined, the proportion of non-Muslim customers is higher than the proportion of non-Muslim customers that Islamic banks get. So I agree with that. It should appeal to the mainstream. I think that's really it's what you're talking about there is more of a branding issue, right? So why brand it Islamic finance versus just calling it something else? A lot of the debate in the industry has been, why don't we just call it ethical finance? I think the reason you call it Islamic finance is because that's your core audience. That's who you want to go after. That's who you want to appeal to. And I think that's important. It's important to have that differentiation. It's important to demonstrate that you are different to that audience. I think the problem with ethical and saying your ethical finance and therefore Islamic is the definition of ethical differs country to country. The definition of ethical differs over time. Islamic is a subset of ethical. What's ethical may not necessarily be Islamic, if that makes sense. So I think Islamic finance does need to have its own identity. Islamic fintech does need to have its own identity. And I think by using that as a term for the sector, I think you're also able to define what that sector is and map it. Whether those firms themselves go out and market that way to the consumer, I think is entirely up to them. And I've seen both models work well, where they are branded Islamic finance and where they're not branded Islamic finance. And I think the traction is not really dependent on whether you're branded Islamic finance or not. It's on the quality of your product and the delivery through your service.
We just focus on the UK for a second. We mentioned that the UK was a hub for activity, and according to your research back in 2017, it was like number 4, I think you said. And there's been a lot of activity, but it seems to me over the past couple of years there's been a bit of a drop off. And anecdotally, when I speak to friends or people in the market, or just people just generally, they're quite skeptical of Islamic finance and by extension Islamic fintechs. Like, why do you think that is?
So we actually, we try and tackle this issue through our research as to what are the perceptions of Islamic finance, and we look at it more from the sector's point of view rather than the consumer's point of view. So we look at it from founders and service providers to the industry, and I think part of the problem is that there's a lack of capital that goes into the Islamic finance or Islamic fintech space globally. It is the number one problem that founders identify. I think the comments by Hussein were interesting because as an investor, I'm pretty sure he's looking at this sector and looking at where are the exit opportunities, and we haven't really seen many exit opportunities at the moment. And I think that is that's an important factor for investors. A lot of time when we're looking at fundraising for Islamic fintechs, that is one question I get asked is what have the exits been in this space? And so I think that this sector moves slightly slower than other tech sectors, and I think for that reason it appears less attractive to investors. But I think it by its nature, Islamic finance is trying to do something different. It's not just trying to pump a valuation of a tech firm and exit. What they're actually trying to do is build robust businesses that deliver value for consumers, and so that takes time. I think the other point is consumer education. I think specifically in the UK, lack of financial knowledge amongst the general population is very low. Amongst the Muslim population is pretty bad, and then add on to that, the understanding and appreciation of Islamic finance is fairly low as well. And so a lot of these Islamic fintechs have to do a lot of face-to-face education. So what you will see is Islamic fintech firms going to conferences, to industry groups, to mosques, to trade shows, and setting up a stand and talking to people. I mean, most of these businesses are designed where you can download the app, um, do your KYC on the app, start investing on the app, and you never have to speak to an individual. However, uh, what we see is that the consumers will want to have a level of comfort before they do that, and therefore that face-to-face interaction is really important. So consumer education becomes a big part of it. And then there's the challenges we've spoken about. So, being in a regulated industry, getting through all of that is tough. And then the other question that investors will ask is where's the scale in this, right? You've proven that the business model works. How do you scale it? And so part of that is going to be through either diversifying your product offering or geographic expansion. And what we've seen until recently, geographic expansion was quite difficult. Now we have other countries where the regulatory regimes are becoming more accommodating to fintech, and those geographic expansion opportunities are starting to emerge. So some of the firms that we mentioned before have been at the early adopters of that geographic expansion. And that's why they're starting to demonstrate some scale.
With in the UK, there is this activity, and you've mentioned about this. But I would also say, like, some of these providers that you've mentioned and we've talked about, they're not that some of there are needs, like in certain product sectors, right? Product segments rather. So, for example, things like corporate financing, or car financing, or things like that. The fintechs don't seem to be going into these kind of spots. They're kind of going to more like safer routes, like e-wallet licenses or robo advisory or something like this. Why do you think they haven't really tackled the more like difficult sectors?
Well, I think that trajectory kind of mirrors mirrors what's happening in the conventional space. So things like robo advisory, alternative finance, were some of the early peer-to-peer, e-money payment gateways. Those types of things were some of the um, early boom areas within fintech, and that's been the case within Islamic fintech as well. SME financing is an interesting one because SME financing took off in the conventional fintech sector, but debt and interest based. And obviously, in Islamic finance, you need to do something different. And so we are starting to see that. I think you had Harris on the podcast with Cordoba Capital Markets. That pioneered this profit participatory note. I think this is an innovation within the Islamic finance space. I think it's yet to possibly become a fintech platform with a technology front end, but I think that's on the cards. And I think that's a real innovation. I think car finance you mentioned. I think we've just seen a launch of a service in the UK for taxi drivers to finance their vehicles.
Yeah,
And
I
taxi driver communities being predominantly Muslim, it is being done Islamically. So these things are emerging. I think they take time. There's got to be a will and some backing to do this. But I would say, having used most of the Islamic fintech services that exist in the UK, I think they're doing a pretty good job. I think they're competitive for the most part. I think their service offering is good. Fintech, startups generally are hard things to be successful at. The nature of the nature of any sort of risk capital industry is that a lot of firms will need to be launched for some of them to be successful. And therefore some of those firms won't be successful. I think that's just the nature of the startup scene. But what I do see is the approach taken by founders in Islamic fintech, and I have the opportunity to speak to a lot of them one to one. Most of them are in it because they're trying to produce a service that they don't have access to. So whether it's home financing, car financing, SME financing, investment, they've perceived a gap in the market that they felt they've not been able to access that through either Islamic banks, or they can't access it through the conventional route um, uh, because it contravenes Sharia compliance, and so they've gone about setting that up themselves. So most of them are in it, not why most people get into startups, which is I think I have a cool idea and I think it would be worth a lot. Of course, they want to be successful and scale their companies and have good valuations and good exits, but their primary driver tends to be that they are wanting to provide a service for the Muslim community in the UK.
Yeah, definitely, it's within your niyyah, which sets the first principles. Abdul Hasib, what do you think of the UK at the moment in terms of its Islamic finance landscape more broadly?
So I think the UK since Brexit has been struggling on a number of fronts. I think fintech is no exception to that. If you look at the investment figures around fintech generally, the UK has always punched above its weight, but those numbers have been declining. Investment is really the driver of this market in sort of especially at the early stage, and with interest rates on the rise around the world and the end of sort of free money, it's becoming more and more difficult to raise. And I think because of that, you're going to see the fintech sector struggle. And I think naturally because of that, you'll also see the Islamic fintech sector struggle. Now, the one avenue that we do have within the Islamic finance space is raising from within our own community. And I think the likes of Wahid, IFG that we mentioned, firms like FIDA are very good at doing that. And I think that may be the thing that helps them weather this period where uh, the other types of funding, like VC funding, are less available.
Yeah. As we bring the podcast to a close shortly, what are your thoughts on the global Islamic fintech ecosystem going for the rest of 24 and 25?
So I'm fairly bullish. I think we project that the size of the market last year was 137.5 billion dollars, and it's projected by our estimations to grow to 306 billion dollars by 2027. That's a growth rate of approximately 17% per year. That's higher than the growth rate that we project for conventional fintech. So there is really headroom to grow here. Where that headroom is important, and this is all available in our report. We think that headroom is really going to come in Southeast Asia and the GCC. We think Europe has a role to play in that growth. Sector-wise, I think there are some saturated sectors. So alternative finance, as I mentioned, things like sort of challenger banking, I think is now more established, and payments, of course, as the sort of the enabler to a digital economy. But I think areas around social finance, capital markets, digital assets, insurance, these sort of areas within financial services have still more room to grow. And so I'm bullish. I think we will see more and more innovation in this space. I think what ecosystems and policymakers can do is really look at and assess those levers that they can deploy. So regulation, capital, and talent. I think most of them have pretty progressive regulation now. I think the capital space is hugely underdeveloped, and there's lots of opportunity to do things in the capital space. And I think the talent space, most of these countries recognize that their demographies are very much sort of skewed towards the youth. Those youth need to be in technology enabled careers in the future. Therefore, they need to provide them the opportunities and the education system to be able to do that. And so, focusing on local talent base is going to be hugely important. And if you look at where that talent base exists in large population centers like Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan. And so there's lots of potential in those countries for the talent base to emerge with the right capital and regulatory support. I think for the Islamic fintech sectors to develop in those countries, and probably develop at a pace that far outstrips conventional fintech in those countries is very, very possible.
Yeah, I don't think Islamic fintech is too like in terms of the risks. I don't think it's too dissimilar from like other conventional fintechs. Like in terms, like I think you mentioned, like interest rate, the end of free money or virtually free money, and some of the other risks. But like one of the things that just got me thinking was what Hussein said, Hussein Kanji, when about the big funds like your Sequoias or like your the big ones in America or the ones big ones globally, they don't seem to really have like a specific Islamic mandate. What would like how can you prompt them to like be more interested? Because I think one of the things and more for the Islamic finance industry is that if you get the larger incumbents, albeit from conventional finance, so maybe their intentions are not about a more wholesome system, but how do you get the larger players to come into this market?
So I don't think you'll ever get Sequoia or someone else to have an Islamic mandate. I think that's very difficult. And I've spoken to VC funds who've explored this idea, because when they go and raise money from the Middle East, an LP may say, "Oh, what you're doing is great. Could you do it Islamically?" They don't have the specialism for that. I think that has to be built by the Muslim community. And I think you're starting to see that happen, right? So there are more ways to invest in startups today, and Muslim founders than there's ever been, both here in the UK and in Asia and the Middle East as well. And so I think we are going to have to build that ourselves. I think where those types of VCs get involved, they get involved in projects where they feel scale exists. So some of the firms that I mentioned previously have raised from conventional VCs. And we will continue to see that, because the conventional VCs see the scale opportunity in what they're doing. And I think that it's for us to nurture that ecosystem with more early stage capital in order for those firms to develop and be of the size and scale potential that captures the interest of more conventional VCs from other parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Abdul Hasib, tell us more about any projects, upcoming or current projects you're working on.
So our mainstay research, the Global Islamic FinTech report, is here to stay. The latest version was released in February. It's available on salamgateway.com as a free download. So I encourage everyone to download, have a look. If there's anything you would like to talk about from that report, I'm always available and happy to talk to anyone in the industry. I think where I'm squarely focused now, looking forward in sort of what we do in my career, it is really that helping solve that capital challenge for Muslim founders, specifically in Islamic fintech. We do have a nascent fund, the Islamic Fintech Fund, which has clubbed together a load of our ventures that we've built and investments that we've made. And we're looking to raise external LP capital to formalize that into a VC fund in the near future, and we're working on that at the moment. And then more broadly, I still work with Islamic fintechs, with banks, with financial centers, and regulators around the world on how they can improve their ecosystem for Islamic fintechs, and we'll continue to do that. I believe there's still real opportunity, globally in Islamic fintech for further growth, and so we'll continue to champion this space.
Fantastic. And Abdul Hasib, are you active on social media?
I am. You can find me on LinkedIn, Abdul Hasib Basit, and on X or Twitter, Abdul H Basit.
Great. This has been great. Abdul Hasib Basit, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jazakallah khair.